October 9th, 2020. A Friday morning meant for celebration. Jamie Faith stepped onto the sidewalk of his trendy Dallas neighborhood to walk the dogs, his wife Jennifer at his side to mark their 15th anniversary. Seconds later, 7 bullets from a .45 caliber handgun tore through the morning fog, leaving Jamie dead in the gutter and Jennifer screaming in the street. To the public, she was a broken survivor. In reality, she was a digital ghost, a puppet master who had spent months scripting her husband's death through a web of fake identities and thousand-mile lies. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Oak Cliff, Dallas, a neighborhood where historic charm meets a new, polished urban energy. South Waverly Drive was lined with trees that offered a fragile shield against the oppressive Texas sun, a place where professionals like Jamie Faith found a quiet sanctuary away from the glass and steel grind of the city center. Jamie was a man of routine, the kind of neighbor who didn't just wave, but stopped to ask about your day. A man whose presence felt like a steady, low-frequency hum of reliability. At 49 years old, he had built a life that most would call the pinnacle of the American middle-class experience. As a technology director for American Airlines, Jamie was more than just a corporate executive. He was a problem solver, a pillar of a massive global network who ensured that thousands of travelers reached their destinations safely every single day. His life was defined by a quiet dignity, a preference for the background over the spotlight. Colleagues remembered him as a gentle soul, a gentle giant who stood over 6 feet tall but carried himself with a soft-spoken kindness that disarmed everyone in the room. He wasn't a man for loud boasts or flashy displays of wealth. Instead, he invested his energy into his home, into the historic house on South Waverly Drive, and into the woman he had promised his life to 15 years earlier. Jennifer Faith, 48, was the social engine of the pair. If Jamie was the quiet foundation, Jennifer was the vibrant facade. She was known throughout the Oak Cliff community as a devoted wife, a woman who seemed to wrap her entire identity around her husband and their shared life. Neighbors saw them walking their 2 dogs, Maggie and Air Bear, every morning like clockwork, a domestic ritual that signaled all was right in their world. Jennifer worked as a speech pathologist, a career built on empathy and communication, which only served to reinforce the image of her as a nurturing, supportive partner. In social settings, she was the one who remembered birthdays, who organized the dinners, and who ensured that the Faith name was synonymous with warmth and hospitality. The atmosphere of Dallas in the early autumn is one of lingering heat, a thick, humid air that refuses to acknowledge the calendar. In Oak Cliff, this heat settles into the wood of the old craftsman-style homes and the asphalt of the winding streets. Jamie Faith was a man who appreciated the history of his surroundings. He enjoyed the texture of the old neighborhood, the way the sidewalk was cracked by the roots of massive oaks, the way the sound of the light rail would echo in the distance. He found peace in the manual labor of maintaining his property, the smell of freshly cut grass, the grit of the Texas soil under his fingernails during weekend gardening. He wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, a trait that stood in contrast to his high-level corporate responsibilities. At American Airlines, his world was one of servers, code, and global logistics. But at home, he was a man who simply wanted to build something lasting. Their life followed a predictable, comforting rhythm. The morning walks with the dogs were sacred, a time for the couple to connect before the demands of the day pulled them in different directions. Jamie would head north toward the airport, his mind already shifting into the high-stakes world of airline technology, while Jennifer would prepare for her sessions with patients, using her voice and her training to help others find theirs. They were a team, 2 halves of a whole that seemed to balance each other perfectly. His grounded nature provided the anchor for her more expressive, sometimes volatile personality. He was the calm in her occasional storms, the voice of reason when her emotions ran high. It was a dynamic that had sustained them for 15 years. Or so Jamie believed as he prepared to celebrate their anniversary in October of 2020. The neighborhood of Oak Cliff itself played a role in their identity. It was a place for strivers, those who had moved beyond the sterile developments of the suburbs to find something with more character. The Faiths fit this mold perfectly. They were seen as a success story of the urban revival, a couple that contributed to the vitality of the city. Their presence on South Waverly Drive was a constant, a familiar sight for neighbors who were also navigating the complexities of modern life. They represented the dream, the idea that with hard work and a loyal partner, one could build a life of meaning and comfort in the heart of Texas. This was the biography of the Faiths, a story of corporate achievement, community involvement, and marital bliss. A story that Jamie Faith was proud to be the protagonist of, never realizing he was actually a secondary character in a tragedy of Jennifer's making. 700 miles of interstate and winding rural roads separated the manicured lawns of Oak Cliff from the dense, unyielding woods of Cumberland Furnace, Tennessee. In that isolated corner of the South, life moved with a deliberate, heavy slowness, a far cry from the corporate hustle of Dallas. This was the world of Darren Lopez, a man whose life had become a series of quiet, repetitive days defined by the physical and mental scars of a decade spent in uniform. Darren was an Army veteran, a man who had once been a paratrooper, jumping into the unknown with a sense of purpose that had long since evaporated. His service had left him with more than just memories. He carried the permanent weight of a traumatic brain injury sustained during a deployment to Iraq, a hidden fracture in his cognitive foundation that made the world feel sharp, unpredictable, and often overwhelming. By early 2020, Darren was living a solitary existence, his days centered around his disability and a sense of profound isolation that was only amplified by the onset of the global pandemic. He was a man who lived in the past, a man for whom the present offered very little in the way of hope or mission. And then, a notification on a screen bridged the 700-mile gap. Jennifer Faith had reached out via social media, a digital echo from a high school romance that had flickered and faded more than 30 years prior. To Darren, she wasn't the sophisticated wife of a tech executive. She was the girl from the late 80s, a reminder of a time before the wars, before the brain injury, and before the loneliness. The reconnection was instantaneous and obsessive. In the vacuum of the pandemic lockdowns, their digital interaction became a lifeline. But for Darren, it quickly transformed into a renewed duty. Jennifer didn't just offer nostalgia, she offered a narrative of a life in ruins. While her neighbors in Dallas saw a woman in a happy, prosperous marriage, the version of Jennifer that appeared on Darren's phone was a woman trapped in a chamber of horrors. She began to feed him a meticulously crafted story of systemic abuse, claiming that the gentle giant Jamie Faith was, in reality, a monster who subjected her to physical, emotional, and sexual torment on a daily basis. Darren's TBI made him particularly vulnerable to this kind of emotional hijacking. His brain was wired for the protector role, a vestige of his military training that sought out clear-cut missions and identifiable enemies. Jennifer knew exactly which buttons to press. She told him that she was a prisoner in her own home, that she was being monitored, and that she feared for her very life. She didn't just tell him, she inundated him with a volume of communication that bordered on the impossible. In a single month, the two exchanged over 14,000 text messages, a digital tether that ensured Darren was never more than a few minutes away from her latest crisis. She painted Jamie as a man who used his size and his status to maintain an absolute, terrifying control over her every move. To a man like Darren, who lived by a code of honor and defense, this was a call to arms. He began to see himself not as a disabled veteran in a small Tennessee town, but as a knight in a modern-day tragedy. The distance between them didn't weaken the bond, it romanticized it. He was the only one who knew the truth, the only one who could hear her silent screams from 700 miles away. The relationship wasn't built on shared experiences or physical presence. It was built on a shared delusion, a fantasy of rescue that Jennifer was scripting in real time. As the months of 2020 bled together, the intensity of their connection reached a fever pitch. Darren became hyper-focused on Jennifer's safety, his thoughts consumed by the perceived threats from a man he had never met. Jennifer's manipulation was surgical. She sent him descriptions of injuries that didn't exist and accounts of arguments that never happened. She made sure he knew that she had no one else to turn to. that her life was in his hands. He was no longer just an old flame. He was her sole provider of hope. The psychological entrapment was absolute. Darren's world narrowed until it consisted only of his phone and the woman on the other end of it. He began to neglect his own life in Tennessee, his mind permanently fixed on the house on South Waverly Drive in Dallas. He was being groomed, transformed from a broken warrior into a targeted weapon. Jennifer ensured that the image of Jamie Faith was synonymous with pure evil, a target that needed to be neutralized for the greater good. Darren Lopez didn't see the woman who was organizing anniversary dinners and walking dogs in Oak Cliff. He saw a victim whose only chance for survival was his intervention. He was a man looking for a mission to give his life meaning again. And Jennifer Faith had given him the most dangerous mission of all. Their relationship was a masterclass in digital puppetry, a long-distance dance where every step Darren took was dictated by the lies Jennifer whispered through the screen. By the late summer of 2020, the foundation was laid. The protector was ready, the enemy was identified, and the puppet master was about to pull the final string. The architecture of a murder is rarely built solely of steel and lead. Often, it is woven from the invisible threads of digital data, a tapestry of binary code designed to strangle the truth long before a trigger is ever pulled. Jennifer Faith was not merely a participant in a long-distance affair. She was the lead architect of a sprawling, multi-layered hall of mirrors. To keep Darren Lopez anchored in her reality, she didn't just tell lies. She created an entire ecosystem of corroboration. She understood that in the vacuum of a screen, perception is the only truth that matters. And she set out to manipulate Darren's perception until he was incapable of seeing anything but the monster she had drawn for him. She began by creating a series of fraudulent email accounts, a digital supporting cast intended to validate her claims of abuse. The most devastating of these was a fake account she established in her husband's name. Under the guise of Jamie Faith, she sent emails to Darren that were calculated to incite a primal, violent protective instinct. In these messages, Jamie didn't just admit to the abuse, he reveled in it. He described horrific acts of violence and sexual degradation with a cold, mocking arrogance, taunting Darren with the reality of Jennifer's suffering. The Jamie in these emails was a caricature of a villain, a man who bragged about his power and mocked the broken paratrooper who could do nothing to stop him. For Darren, reading these words was like feeling a physical blow, a direct challenge to his masculinity and his military code of honor. But Jennifer didn't stop at creating an antagonist. She knew that for the deception to hold, there needed to be witnesses. She created another persona, a friend named Stockholm, who reached out to Darren to provide updates on Jennifer's condition. Stockholm was the sympathetic observer, the one who saw the bruises Jamie supposedly left behind, the one who heard the screams through the walls. This persona added a layer of objective reality to the lies. It wasn't just a victim talking anymore. It was a witness confirming the horror. Jennifer, sitting in her quiet Dallas living room while Jamie worked in the other room, was simultaneously playing the victim, the villain, and the witness. A one-woman theater of the macabre. The sensory immersion of the deception was total. Darren would sit in his Tennessee home, the blue light of his phone illuminating a face hardened by the intelligence he was receiving. Jennifer sent him photos, images of bruises and welts she claimed Jamie had inflicted. Some were old photos from years prior, unrelated to any conflict. Others were images she likely sourced from the dark corners of the internet. To Darren, these weren't just pixels on a screen, they were evidence. They were the battle damage of a war he was failing to win. Every vibration of his phone was a fresh report from the front lines. Every notification, a plea for extraction. The psychological toll on Darren was immense. His traumatic brain injury already made it difficult for him to process complex emotional nuances. He needed the world to be binary, good versus evil, mission versus failure. Jennifer provided that clarity. She stripped away the reality of a flawed but normal marriage and replaced it with a high-stakes rescue operation. She utilized M-dashes of emotional urgency, pauses in her communication that left Darren spiraling in anxiety, followed by ellipses of lingering despair that made him feel like her time was running out. She was his commander, and his orders were becoming increasingly clear. The threat had to be neutralized. She even went as far as to create fake personas of Jamie's colleagues, employees, at American Airlines, who supposedly contacted her to warn her about Jamie's erratic and dangerous behavior at work. These emails described a man on the edge, a man who was becoming increasingly unstable and violent. It was a 360-degree digital gaslighting effort. Darren was surrounded by proof from every angle: the husband's own admissions, the friend's observations, and the co-workers' warnings. There was no room for doubt, no space for the real Jamie Faith to exist in Darren's mind. The volume of this digital onslaught was staggering. They weren't just messaging, they were living a parallel life in the cloud. They spoke for hours about a future together, a life in Tennessee after the obstacle was removed. Jennifer promised him a world where he was the hero, where his injuries didn't matter because he had saved the one thing that was worth saving. She weaponized his loneliness, using the isolation of the pandemic to ensure he had no other voices to counter her narrative. As the calendar turned toward October, the tone of the Jamie emails became even more aggressive. Jamie threatened to kill Jennifer, to take her away where Darren would never find her. The puppet master was accelerating the timeline. She was creating a ticking clock scenario, a classic manipulative tactic designed to force a decision. Darren felt the walls closing in. He was a paratrooper who had been told that his target was about to execute a civilian, and the only way to stop it was to strike first. Jennifer Faith spent months staring at her screen, her fingers dancing across the keyboard to create a husband who deserved to die. She didn't just want Jamie gone. She wanted Darren to believe that killing him was an act of mercy, an act of justice. She watched the data flow back and forth across 700 miles, seeing Darren's resolve harden into a cold, lethal intent. The digital deception was complete. The monster had been fully realized in the mind of the protector. All that remained was for the puppet to make the journey, and for the puppet master to watch the final act from the front row. The 700-mile corridor between Middle Tennessee and the heart of Dallas is a transit of changing landscapes, shifting from the dense, humid hardwoods of the South to the expansive, sun-bleached plains of North Texas. For Darren Lopez, this was not a road trip. It was a deployment. On the evening of October 8th, 2020, he climbed into his dark blue Nissan Titan, a vehicle that would soon become the most hunted piece of steel in the state of Texas. He adjusted his seat, gripped the wheel with the practiced intensity of a man on a kinetic mission, and began the 10-hour drive towards South Waverly Drive. The hum of the tires on Interstate 40 served as a rhythmic backdrop to the digital ghost stories Jennifer had spent months whispering into his ear. Every mile closer to Dallas was a mile closer to justice. A mile closer to the moment he would finally neutralize the man he believed was a monster. He arrived in Dallas under the cover of the pre-dawn darkness. The city was still, the skyscrapers of the West End glowing like distant beacons, while the residential streets of Oak Cliff remained shrouded in the long shadows of the massive oaks. Lopez didn't go to a hotel. He didn't seek rest. He found his way to the Faith's neighborhood and waited. He was a hunter in a suburban blind. He knew the routine down to the minute because the puppet master had provided the schedule. He knew when the alarm would go off. He knew which door they would exit. And he knew the exact path they would take to walk the dogs. He sat in the idling truck, the "One Nation Under God" decal on his rear window, a stark irony in the face of the violence he was about to unleash. At 7:30 a.m., the front door of the house on South Waverly Drive opened. Jamie Faith stepped out into the crisp morning air, unaware that this was the final morning of his life. It was his 15th wedding anniversary, a milestone that represented a decade and a half of shared history, corporate climbs, and domestic stability. He was wearing an American Airlines hoodie, a garment that symbolized the career he had built with his own intellect and grit. Beside him was Jennifer, the woman who had spent the last few hours likely coordinating the very ambush that was about to occur. They walked together, their two dogs pulling gently on their leashes, heading toward the corner of the block, just as they had done hundreds of times before. The air in Oak Cliff that morning was cool, a brief respite before the Texas heat returned. The neighborhood was beginning to stir. the sound of distant traffic, and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog providing a soundtrack of normalcy. But the silence on South Waverly was suddenly shattered by the mechanical roar of the Nissan Titan's engine. Lopez didn't hesitate. He didn't offer a warning. He pulled the truck alongside the couple and stepped out, his movements clinical and devoid of hesitation. He was a paratrooper again, and the target was in his sights. The first shot was a deafening crack that echoed off the historic facades of the surrounding homes. Jamie Faith didn't have time to react, didn't have time to understand that the protector his wife had recruited was standing mere feet away. The .45 caliber rounds were devastating. Lopez fired again and again. 3 shots struck Jamie in the back, the force of the heavy projectiles driving him toward the pavement. As he collapsed, Lopez moved closer, ensuring there was no possibility of survival. He fired 4 more times into Jamie's chest and head, 7 bullets in total, a level of overkill that spoke to the deep-seated rage and manipulation Lopez had been fed. The scene was a chaotic tableau of violence. The dogs, Maggie and Air Bear, were frantic, their leashes tangling as their owner lay dying in the gutter. Jennifer was on the ground, screaming, a performance that began the second the first shell casing hit the asphalt. Lopez, his mission complete, didn't linger. He climbed back into the Titan and accelerated away from the scene, his tires chirping against the pavement as he vanished into the morning traffic. He was headed back to Tennessee, believing he had saved a life, unaware that he had just signed his own death warrant in the eyes of the law. As the smoke cleared and the smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the humid air, the neighbors began to pour out of their homes. Chris Kirby, a resident of South Waverly, ran toward the screams and found a scene of absolute horror. Jamie Faith was unresponsive, the life draining out of him onto the street he had walked every day for years. Jennifer was the center of the chaos, her voice raw with grief as she wailed over her husband's body. She played the part of the traumatized survivor with a terrifying proficiency. When the first Dallas police officers arrived on the scene, she was ready with her narrative. She told the investigators that a man had jumped out of a truck and tried to rob them. She claimed he had demanded her jewelry, that he had tried to take her purse. And when Jamie resisted, the man had opened fire. It was a story designed to fit the profile of a random urban crime, a tragedy of wrong place, wrong time. She described the struggle, her voice trembling as she recounted the non-existent details of the robbery. She made sure to mention how much she loved Jamie, how they were celebrating their anniversary, and how he had died trying to protect her. But even in those first frantic moments, there were cracks in the facade. The brutality of the shooting didn't match a robbery. Thieves don't typically fire 7 rounds from a heavy caliber handgun into a victim who is already down. They don't linger to ensure a kill. They take the valuables and run. Yet nothing had been stolen. Jennifer's jewelry was still on her person. Jamie's wallet was still in his pocket. The robber had ignored the valuables and focused entirely on the execution. While Jennifer was being comforted by neighbors and questioned by detectives, Jamie Faith's body was covered with a sheet. The director of technology for American Airlines, the gentle giant of Oak Cliff, was gone. He had been executed on his own street, in front of his own home, on a day meant for celebration. And as Jennifer sat in the back of a patrol car, her face buried in her hands, she wasn't mourning the man under the sheet. She was likely already thinking about the next text message, the next lie, and the insurance policy that was now hers to claim. The morning walk had ended, and the puppet master's most daring act was just beginning. The transition from a random robbery to a cold-blooded execution began with the silent witnesses of South Waverly Drive, the ring cameras and private surveillance systems of Jamie Faith's neighbors. While Jennifer sat in the interview room, painting a picture of a frantic struggle and a desperate thief, Dallas police detectives were already watching a different story unfold on their screens. A dark blue Nissan Titan, distinctive for its extended cab and a very specific white decal on the rear window that read, "One Nation Under God," had been caught idling near the scene minutes before the shooting. It didn't look like a vehicle looking for a quick score. It looked like a vehicle on a stakeout. The detectives' first hint that the robbery story was a fabrication came from the physical evidence at the scene. Jamie Faith hadn't just been shot, he had been targeted. The forensic team noted the tight grouping of the wounds, a hallmark of a shooter who was both calm and practiced. Furthermore, the lack of any missing valuables made the robbery motive feel hollow. When investigators asked Jennifer for consent to search her phone, she gave it with a confidence that suggested she believed her digital tracks had been swept clean. She assumed the role of the grieving, cooperative widow, never imagining that the data she thought was deleted would become the very rope that would hang her. As the tech specialists in the digital forensics lab began to peel back the layers of Jennifer's mobile device, they found a volume of communication that defied logic for a woman in a happy marriage. In the months leading up to the murder, Jennifer and a contact named Darren Lopez had exchanged more than 14,000 text messages. The sheer density of the data was staggering, averaging over 600 messages per day. This wasn't just an affair, it was a full-time occupation. And as the detectives read the transcripts, the robbery narrative evaporated, replaced by a chilling blueprint for murder. The trail led directly to Cumberland Furnace, Tennessee. Using the One Nation Under God decal as a digital fingerprint, investigators searched registration records for dark blue Nissan Titans. They found a match in the driveway of a disabled veteran who had once been Jennifer's high school sweetheart. The GPS data from the truck confirmed the worst. The vehicle had made a non-stop 700-mile sprint from Tennessee to Dallas on the night before the murder, and it had returned to Tennessee immediately after the trigger was pulled. The random thief was actually a man who had spent 10 hours on the road just to satisfy Jennifer's bloodlust. But the investigation soon uncovered an even more grotesque layer of the puppet master's plan, the financial exploitation of Jamie's death. Almost immediately after the funeral, Jennifer launched a GoFundMe campaign titled Support Jennifer and Family. She went on local news stations, her face twisted in a mask of practiced sorrow, pleading for the community's help to get her through this dark time. The people of Oak Cliff and Jamie's colleagues at American Airlines responded with overwhelming generosity, raising over $60,000 for the woman they believed was a broken survivor. The detectives watched as the money began to move. Jennifer wasn't using the funds for therapy or bills. She was using the community's charity to reward her executioner. Digital records showed she had applied for a credit card in Darren Lopez's name and was using the GoFundMe donations to pay it off. She bought him gifts, expensive electronics, a large screen television, even parts for the very truck he had used to drive to Texas and kill her husband. She was literally paying for the hit with the money raised in the victim's name. The puppet master had even tried to coordinate the cover-up through the same screen she used to plan the crime. Detectives found messages sent after the murder where she instructed Darren to remove the One Nation Under God sticker from his truck, warning him that the feds might be looking for it. She told him she loved him, that they were almost free, and that once the insurance money cleared, they would never have to worry again. She was juggling 3 different realities: the public grief of a widow, the secret passion of a lover, and the calculated greed of a fraudster. By the time the Dallas police reached out to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the trap was set. They didn't just have a suspect, they had a confession written in binary code. Every fake email, every manufactured bruise, and every dollar of stolen charity was laid out in a chronological timeline of betrayal. Jennifer Faith had spent years helping others find their voice as a speech pathologist. But in the quiet of her home, she had used her own voice to script the end of a man who had done nothing but love her. The investigation was no longer about finding a killer. It was about exposing the woman who had created one. The digital trap snapped shut in January 2021 when federal agents arrested Jennifer Faith. She was initially charged with obstruction of justice, but as the scale of her interstate manipulation came into focus, the indictment expanded to include the heavy weight of use of interstate commerce facilities in the commission of murder for hire. The puppet master had finally lost control of the narrative. Facing the undeniable evidence of her 14,000 messages and the GoFundMe fraud, Jennifer pleaded guilty in February 2022 to the murder for hire charge. In June of that year, a Dallas courtroom became the setting for her final sentencing: life in federal prison. Darren Lopez, the veteran she had groomed into an executioner, eventually faced his own day of reckoning. He pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to 62 years in prison, a stark reminder of the cost of his blind loyalty to a ghost. In court, the truth was finally laid bare. There were no bruises, no monster in the house, only a woman who traded her husband's life for a digital fantasy. Jamie Faith's legacy isn't found in his corporate achievements or the historic charm of Oak Cliff. It's found in the silence of a street that lost its heartbeat. He walked toward a celebration, never realizing his wife had already scripted his death in the cold light of a Tennessee screen. Today, Jennifer sits in a cell, her 14,000 digital lies finally extinguished by the absolute weight of a life sentence. The puppet master has no audience left, leaving only the void where a gentle giant once stood. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.